Hi, I'm Kara Montgomery, and this is a bolt of my So Easy Chenille flannel that I designed for Timeless Treasures. Many of you may already be aware of the chenille technique, where fabrics are layered, stitched, snipped, and then laundered to create this wonderful chenille surface. It's a very easy technique, and we've taken most of the work out of it now by printing the lines directly on the flannel fabric. I'm going to walk you through the how-to step by step. A chenille quilt is a non-traditional technique. It's simply 4 layers of fabric that are basted together and stitched. There's no batting involved. The stitching must be done on a diagonal or on the bias of the fabric, so that when the stitching is completed, you can snip between the layers, releasing the tension, and when it's laundered, this wonderful surface happens. If you were to stitch on the straight of the grain, you would have strings involved, more like a rag quilt. Traditionally, these lines are all drawn onto the top layer of the fabric so that they can be stitched evenly. While it's always been possible to stitch diagonal patterns into the chenille design, it's been a bit tedious to try and mark all of the lines and measure them accurately on the top piece of fabric. The So Easy chenille piece from Timeless Treasures already has the zigzag pattern pre-printed on the top of the flannel, so there's no marking necessary. Once you put your 4 layers together, and for this project I've chosen to use a darker tan face down on the back. This will be the back of my quilt. And then I've layered 2 lighter shades on top and topped it with the So Easy chenille piece with the pre-printed lines. And I choose to use an inexpensive serger thread to baste my layers together. A very long needle. These are John James brand number 7 long darners. I choose to use a serger thread for my basting because it's a lesser ply thread than my regular sewing thread. And if I happen to stitch through it, when I'm pulling the basting out, the serger thread will break before my sewing thread. Once your layers have been basted together, it's time to stitch on each of the pre-printed lines using a regular sewing thread. The So Easy chenille flannel is available in a cream with a darker tan line or in a white with a light blue line, although you can choose either for any color quilt. For example, our pink sample has a top layer of white with the light blue lines, but as you can see, it's only the width of the thread that was used, and the pink variegated stitching easily covers up the light blue line. After all of your stitching is completed, it's time to trim up the edges. I prefer that my quilts have a rounded corner because I'll be applying bias binding. I use my rotary cutter to trim up the edges, and then I use a CD as a template to round my corners before I apply the binding. There's one more step before your binding is applied. You're going to be cutting through each of these channels, and you need to be able to get your scissors inside the channel. So we're going to insert the scissors inside the top 3 layers, not through the bottom layer, but I'm going to make a snip in each one of these channels before I apply the binding, so that after the binding is on, I'll be able to get my scissors inside. Once you've snipped at least one end of all of the channels for the entire length of the blanket, it's time to apply your binding. Use your favorite method to place the binding on the front side of the quilt, and then fold the binding over to the back and stitch it in place by hand. After the stitching is complete, you're ready to go back and snip the rest of the channels. My personal preference is to use a standard pair of sewing shears that are very sharp. However, there are rotary cutters on the market and special chenille cutters available as well. The rotary cutter with the extended tip has a difficult time turning the corners. That's why I prefer to use standard sewing shears. After you have everything snipped and your binding is complete, it's time to toss the blanket in the washer. It's the washer and the dryer agitation that creates the fluffiness in the channels. The more you wash the blanket, the more beautiful it becomes.